Picture this. It is the dead of night on the Eastern Front in 1943. German soldiers huddle in their trenches, exhausted from another day of combat. Then they hear it, a soft whooshing sound, like wind through trees. But this is no natural sound. This is the sound of death approaching. The Germans called them Nachthexen, the night witches, and they were terrified of them. But here is what makes this story truly remarkable. These fearsome warriors, these pilots who struck such terror into the hearts of Nazi soldiers, were not grizzled veterans. They were not hardened men of combat. They were young women, most of them teenagers. The oldest was just 26 years old, and they flew the oldest, slowest, most fragile planes in the entire Soviet Air Force. Planes made of plywood and canvas. Planes that had been designed for crop dusting and training student pilots. Planes that would burst into flames if hit by a single tracer bullet. Over the course of 4 years, from 1942 to 1945, these young women flew more than 30,000 combat missions. They dropped 23,000 tons of bombs on German positions. They destroyed hundreds of enemy targets. And 23 of them received the highest military honor in the Soviet Union, the title of Hero of the Soviet Union. This is their story, and I promise you, by the end of this video, you will understand why the Germans were so terrified, and why these young women deserve to be remembered as some of the bravest warriors of the Second World War. To understand how this remarkable unit came to be, we need to go back to 1938, and we need to meet a woman named Marina Raskova. Marina Raskova was born on March 28, 1912 in Moscow. Her father was an opera singer, and that was what Marina wanted to be too. She dreamed of standing on stage, her voice filling grand theaters. But tragedy struck when she was just 7 years old. Her father died after being hit by a motorcycle. The family fell on hard times. Marina had to be practical. She gave up her dream of singing and studied chemistry instead. She got a job in a dye factory. She married an engineer named Sergei Raskov and had a daughter. It seemed like her life was set on a very ordinary course. But then, in 1931, everything changed. Marina took a job as a draftswoman at the Aero Navigation Laboratory of the Soviet Air Force Academy, and she fell in love with flying. In 1933, at the age of 21, Marina Raskova became the first woman in the Soviet Union to qualify as a professional air navigator. Think about that for a moment. This was 1930. Most countries would not even allow women near military aircraft. But Marina was navigating them. She divorced her husband in 1935 and devoted herself entirely to aviation. She became a flight instructor. She set long-distance records. The Soviet Union celebrated her as a hero, calling her the Russian Amelia Earhart. Then came September 24, 1938. Marina was the navigator on a flight called Rodina, which means motherland. 3 women flying a twin-engine aircraft attempting to set a world record for non-stop distance flight by women. They flew 6,000 kilometers from Moscow all the way to the Far East. But near the end of the flight, they ran into trouble. Heavy fog, poor visibility. They could not find an airfield, and Marina knew her navigator cockpit had no entrance to the rest of the plane. If they crashed, she would take the full impact. So Marina did something incredibly brave. She bailed out. She parachuted into the wilderness, and in her panic, she forgot to take her emergency kit. For 10 days, Marina Raskova wandered through the forest. No food, no water, no idea where her plane had landed. The rescue crews found her plane after 8 days and waited. Finally, on the 10th day, Marina stumbled out of the woods and found her way to the crash site. She was alive. All 3 women on that flight were awarded the Hero of the Soviet Union medal. They were the first women ever to receive this honor, and Marina Raskova became a national celebrity. She had the ear of Joseph Stalin himself, and she was about to use that access to change history. On June 22, 1941, Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union. Operation Barbarossa. 3 million German soldiers poured across the border. The Soviet Union was caught completely off guard. Within months, the Germans had captured vast territories. Millions of Soviet soldiers were dead or captured. The situation was desperate. Women across the Soviet Union wanted to fight. Women who had trained as pilots in flying clubs. Women who had lost brothers, fathers, husbands to the German invasion. Women who watched their homes burn. They wrote letters. They volunteered. They begged to be allowed to serve, but they were turned away. Women could serve as nurses. Women could work in factories, but women could not fly combat missions. That was for men. Marina Raskova received hundreds of these letters from women pilots. And she knew these women. She had trained with them. She knew they were skilled. She knew they were brave. And she knew the Soviet Union needed every pilot it could get. So Marina went to Joseph Stalin. And on October 8, 1941, Stalin issued Order Number 0099. The Soviet Union would form 3 all-female aviation regiments. Not just the pilots. Everyone. The navigators, the mechanics, the ground crews, all women. The 586th Fighter Aviation Regiment would fly Yak fighters. The 587th Bomber Aviation Regiment would fly PE-2 dive bombers. And the 588th Night Bomber Aviation Regiment would fly Po-2 biplanes. Now, here's where the story gets interesting. The most experienced pilots went to the fighter regiment. They needed lightning reflexes. The second most experienced went to the dive bombers, which Marina Raskova herself would command. And the least experienced pilots were assigned to the 588th Night Bomber Regiment. And they got the worst planes. The Polikarpov Po-2, a biplane designed in 1928, used for training student pilots in dusting crops, made of plywood and canvas stretched over a wooden frame. Maximum speed of 94 miles per hour. No guns, no radios, no radar, no parachutes. One of the pilots, Nadezhda Popova, later called it a coffin with wings. If a single tracer bullet hit the plane, it would go up in flames like a paper airplane. The planes had 2 open cockpits. The pilot sat in front. The navigator, who also served as the bombardier, sat in back. No protection from the wind, no protection from the cold. In winter, their face would get frostbite. Their feet would freeze solid in their boots. And here's the thing about the Po-2. It could only carry 2 bombs, just 2, one under each wing, 350 kilograms total. That is about 770 pounds. Modern fighter jets can carry 10 times that amount. So to make any meaningful impact, these women would have to fly multiple missions. 8 missions per night, 10 missions, sometimes 18 missions in a single night. Take off, fly to the target, drop 2 bombs, fly back, land, reload, take off again, over and over, all night long. The male pilots laughed at them. Some refused to work with them. They were given used uniforms and oversized boots from male pilots. Nothing fit properly. They had to stuff newspaper in their boots, but they had a commander who believed in them. Major Yevdokia Brushinskaya. She was 28 years old. An experienced pilot with 10 years of flying under her belt, orphaned during the Russian Civil War and raised by her uncle. Tough, disciplined, but also protective of her young pilots. She would command the 588th Night Bomber Regiment from its first day in October 1941 until the end of the war, and she never wavered in her belief that these young women could do the impossible. In June of 1942, the 588th Night Bomber Regiment arrived at the front. Their base was near Rostov on the southern front, and they were about to turn their disadvantages into deadly advantages. Remember, the Po-2 was slow, maximum speed of 94 miles per hour. The German Messerschmitt fighters had a stall speed, the slowest they could fly without dropping out of the sky, of 120 miles per hour, which meant the German fighters could not slow down enough to properly target the Po-2s. If they tried, they would stall and crash. The Night Witches could make tight turns and maneuvers that the German fighters simply could not match. The Po-2 flew low, very low, too low for radar to detect. The planes were so small and light that they could hide behind hills, behind trees, flying just above the ground. The Germans could not see them coming. And then there was their most famous tactic, the one that gave them their nickname. The Night Witches would fly in groups of 3. As they approached the target, 2 of the planes would peel off, flying in different directions. This would draw the German searchlights and anti-aircraft fire. The Germans would light up the sky, trying to find the intruders. Meanwhile, the third plane, the one with the bombs, would cut her engine. The propeller would idle, and the plane would glide silently toward the target. The only sound was the wind passing over the wooden struts and canvas wings, a soft whooshing sound. The Germans said it sounded like a witch's broomstick sweeping through the night sky. Nachthexen, night witches. And by the time they heard that sound, it was too late. The bombs were already falling. After dropping the bombs, the pilot would restart the engine and climb away into the darkness. And the whole process would repeat, again and again, all night long. The Germans hated them. They feared them. Hitler himself became convinced that the Soviets must be giving these women special pills or injections that gave them the night vision of cats. How else could they see in the dark? How else could they be so accurate? Years later, Nadezhda Popova laughed when she heard about this rumor. She said this was nonsense, of course. What we did have were clever, educated, very talented girls. The truth was simpler and more impressive. These women navigated by map and compass. They studied their targets. They memorized landmarks. They calculated wind speed and direction in their heads while flying through darkness in an anti-aircraft fire. They were just that good. The Germans were so terrified of the night witches that any Luftwaffe pilot who managed to shoot one down was automatically awarded the Iron Cross. Think about that. Shooting down a slow, unarmed crop duster flown by a young woman was considered such a significant achievement that it earned Germany's highest military decoration. That tells you everything you need to know about how effective these women were and how desperately the Germans wanted them stopped. 32 women of the 588th Night Bomber Regiment died during the war. 32 out of the 261 who served. Some were shot down, some died in crashes, some died from illness. Each one left behind family, friends, dreams unfulfilled. Marina Raskova, the woman who made it all possible, never lived to see the end of the war. On January 4, 1943, she was leading two P-2 bombers to an airfield near Stalingrad. Heavy fog, poor visibility, just like that flight 5 years earlier. But this time, there was no parachute. Marina's plane crashed into a riverbank. Everyone on board the radar. She was 30 years old. The Soviet Union gave Marina Raskova the first state funeral of World War II. Her ashes were buried in the Kremlin wall on Red Square, the highest honor possible. Joseph Stalin himself was one of the pallbearers. An American ship was renamed in her honor. 23 members of the 588th Night Bomber Regiment received the title Hero of the Soviet Union. Major Yevdokia Bershanskaya, who commanded the regiment from its first day to its last, received the Order of Suvorov. She was the only woman ever to receive this prestigious military decoration. The 588th was the most highly decorated female unit in the Soviet Air Force. By any measure, they were one of the most successful bomber units of the entire war, regardless of gender. But here is the part that makes me angry. In October 1945, 6 months after the war ended, the 588th Night Bomber Regiment was disbanded. The women went home. When the Soviet Union held its great victory parade in Moscow, the night witches were not invited. The reason given? Their planes were too slow. The same planes that had struck terror into German soldiers. The same planes that had flown 30,000 combat missions. Too slow for a parade. For decades, the story of the night witches was largely forgotten. In the West, almost no one knew they existed. Even in Russia, their story faded from memory. These women who had risked everything, who had flown through fire and darkness, who had helped turn the tide of the war, were erased from history. But the women themselves never forgot. Nadezhda Popova lived until 2013. She was 91 years old when she died. She had worked as a flight instructor after the war but never flew in combat again. She married, raised a son, lived a quiet life. But she never stopped thinking about those nights in her little bomber, flying through enemy fire with her dear friend Katya. Today, thanks to historians and writers, the story of the night witches is finally being told. Books have been written, documentaries have been made, video games have featured them. In 2013, Google honored Marina Raskova, the Chief of Staff of the 588th, with a special Google Doodle on her 100th birthday. The night witches proved something that should never have needed proving, that courage has no gender, that skill and determination matter more than physical strength, that young women given the chance can be just as fierce, just as deadly, just as heroic as any man. They flew the worst planes, they got the least respect. They faced discrimination from their own side and terror weapons from the enemy, and they still flew 30,000 missions. They still dropped 23,000 tons of bombs. They still earned 23 Hero of the Soviet Union medals. They still became one of the most effective combat units of the entire Second World War. So the next time you hear someone say that women do not belong in combat, remember the Night Witches. Remember Marina Raskova, who gave her life leading female pilots into battle. Remember Yevdokia Bershanskaya, who commanded her regiment for 4 years without wavering. Remember Nadezhda Popova, who flew 852 missions and survived to tell the tale. Remember all 261 women who served in the 588th Night Bomber Regiment. Remember the sound of their engines idling, the whoosh of wind over canvas wings, the terror in German soldiers' hearts when they realized the Night Witches were coming. These young women, these teenagers with flowers painted on their planes and navigation pencils coloring their lips, changed the course of history. They earned their place among the greatest warriors of World War II, and they deserve to be remembered.